Okay, is that showing up okay for everybody?
Yes.
All right, so we're gonna do this in two parts. I'll let Callie take it away here in the beginning, and then I'll pick up a little bit later. So go right ahead.
All right. Hi, I'm Callie. So this is the work that me and Dr. Sterner worked on this past summer. So just some basics. Can you go to the other slide? Yeah, thank you. So just some basics. So you guys already know a little bit about archaeology, but what we were looking for and what archaeologists in general are looking for with these collections are materials that are diagnostic of the temporal region and how they acquired their resources. So for a lot of cases, that would be pottery or chipped stone. These examples could be projectile points, bifaces, unifaces. If you actually look on the left in the top, we have a projectile point. Bottom left is some pottery, actually one of my favorite pieces that we had in our collection. And then on the right is one of our larger bifaces. And then the raw materials that these are made out of and where those raw materials come from can indicate different things about trade or how they acquired their resources. So she already talked about it a little bit. So Conowingo is located on the east bank of the Susquehanna River in Cecil County, Maryland. And it is at the current site of where the Conowingo Dam is. And if you look on the right, you can actually see where Stearns collected and the proposed site boundary in red. And the previous interpretation had it as a late archaic to late woodland site, but our data actually indicates it's a little bit earlier. Yeah, sorry. You can go. All right. So right after this was collected, the site was actually destroyed by the opening of the Conowingo Dam. And this washed away the main site, which is where they had hearths, animal remains, charcoal, and other organic materials. Now it's pretty much washed down to the bedrock, so there's nothing to see there anymore. Some previous investigations at the site were done. The most recent was done by the Archaeological Society of Maryland in 1981. And that was when they determined that it was a late archaic to late woodland site. And their settlement model for that was that it was a seasonal occupation and a central point where smaller social units would come together into this larger camp. And it relied primarily on exotic materials. So Richard Stearns, he was the one who collected the artifacts that we looked at this summer. And I think it's important to talk about him a little bit because he was a little bit different than a lot of the other amateur archaeologists of his time, in that he took very detailed notes of everything he found, not as detailed as someone now may take, but very detailed for his time. And he also sought out as much information and knowledge as he could, excuse me, as he could, so that he could do the best he could with what he found. He became the curator of the Natural History Society of Maryland in the 1930s and actually worked there for 30 years. And these are just some pictures of him on the right that I actually got from Lisa Krause. You can go to the, oh. And to my awesome colleague, Dr. Sterner.
Thanks, Callie. So this is where I pick things up. So the original Stearns collection was described in a 1943 monograph that was published by the Natural History Society of Maryland. And based on what he had in that monograph, it would have consisted of over 3,000 artifacts. So this there are no actual counts of those artifacts. Stearns never recorded them. So, the materials that were included in the collection consisted of pottery sherds, chipstone tools, grooved axes, celts, pestles, pipes, banner stones, and steatite bowl fragments composed most of the assemblage. But all of the counts in this table should be understood as minimum estimates based on Stearns's descriptions. And so if you look in the Maryland Historical Trust site file, these are their extrapolations based on Stearns's descriptions, even though no counts were provided. So this is considered the minimum. However, the 2021 inventory of the Stearns collection that we did yielded a much smaller count of artifacts, unfortunately. So this table describes the current contents of the Stearns collection. And though it's greatly diminished in size, so you'll notice way down there at the bottom, we've got a total of 662 as opposed to over 3,000 artifacts. The Stearns collection still represents a sizable portion of the Conowingo assemblage that has been documented to date. Those of you that know the history of the Natural History Society know that there are lots of different places that these collections could have gone over the years since Stearns collected them, to the Maryland Science Center, to the Maryland Historical Society. So there's lots of places where some of them might have disappeared, but there's still a sizable portion of the collection that remains in the hands of the Natural History Society. And if you compare this with the assemblage generated by the Archaeological Society of Maryland excavations in 1981 and 1982, it really does still compose a very large portion of many of the formal tools that were generated from the site. So what we did was this initial inventory to give us a rough idea of what we had in the assemblage. So now there's an access database including this information. And then we wanted to do some initial additional analyses on portions of the collection that we thought would be the most likely to contribute the most new data to our understanding of the Conowingo site. So initial analyses were conducted on a sample of the groundstone assemblage, targeting artifacts that were produced strategically rather than expediently, meaning that rather than just taking a rock and using it as is without any additional modification, people would have further shaped that rock into the desired form that they wanted to use it in. So this excluded categories like hammerstones, which are usually expedient, as well as choppers, which are usually pretty minimally modified. But it included all other classes of non-chipstone artifacts. I won't go into the fact too much here that the terms groundstone and chipstone are not really the greatest terms to start with. Any of you that know anything about the production of groundstone artifacts, it's usually a process that starts with chipping, actually. People take large chips off of these artifacts and then further modify them by grinding. So technically all stone tools are chipstone tools, but we use groundstone to refer to kind of the traditional stuff that archaeologists have called groundstone, even though it's a bit of a misnomer. So we looked at a few different variables for all of these tools, things like raw material type, the texture of the material. So that was usually determined based on grain size, the completeness of the functional element, its primary function based on shape, secondary function, its use level in 3 categories: light, moderate, or heavy, based on traces of use wear, and metrics like length, width, thickness, and weight, as well as a category we called stage of production that was specifically reserved for axes and banner stones. We got this idea from looking at an exhibit at the State Museum of Pennsylvania, where they have stages for the production of banner stones and grooved axes. And we wanted to definitely focus on that because we have a lot of unfinished tools in our Conowingo collection, and really thought that was important to track that sort of information. So we noted 4 stages of production, and you can see those on the slide here based on banner stone production. So the initial stage, stage 1, is just the shaping through chipping into the rough shape that was desired. Stage 2 is refinement of that shape through pecking. And then stage 3 was for banner stones, drilling. So if you've ever seen a banner stone before, you know that they usually have a hole drilled through the middle where you would fit the shaft of an atlatl. So that's the way that that's figured out. So stage 3 was drilling. And for banner stones, for axes, stage 3 was grooving. And then stage 4 for both artifact classes was polishing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with banner stones, but I should have specified this first because we're gonna talk a lot about banner stones. If you're not familiar with what banner stones are, they're generally interpreted to have been atlatl weights, so spear thrower weights. An atlatl was basically a way to extend the length of your throwing arm, and it would be kind of a hooked rod that you would fit into the back of a long spear, and then you could throw the spear with additional force and get additional distance out of it based on that extra length. So you'd have a weight on the atlatl to increase the balance and weight of that as well. So banner stones are one form of the way that atlatls were weighted, is most people's interpretation of their function. So the banner stones that we have from Conowingo were pretty well distributed across the production stages, with the highest quantities deposited in stage 2, which is modification by pecking, or stage 4, which is the final stage of polishing. Unsurprisingly, the proportion of whole to fragmentary banner stones definitely decreased significantly based on the stage of production. You would expect that. You know, any of you that have tried to craft anything know that the further along you get, the more likely you are to break it, right? So in the earlier stages, you're less likely to screw something up. The further along you get, the more likely that is. Additionally, once you get to the final stage of modification, the artifact is fully produced and you can now break it during use instead of during production. So that trend isn't necessarily surprising in any way. What was surprising to us was the sheer quantity of unbroken stage 1 and stage 2 banner stones. So large proportion of stage 1 and stage 2 banner stones were completely unbroken, and just no further modification was done to these. So it's clear that these are objects that were being produced and then cached at the site for later use to come back and use for later purpose. I will note that I've had it suggested in the past that this is something that would have been used for seasonal fishing at the site. There's not any evidence that anyone would be using atlatls to fish. If you can imagine trying to throw a spear at a fish, it's just not the most efficient way to catch them. So these are generally something that'd be used in large mammal hunting or warfare, that sort of thing. So Conowingo is somewhat unique, I think, in the large quantity of banner stones that are being produced and cached there with the intent of returning for them later. But then, of course, nobody comes back and doesn't remember where they cached them. So raw materials for our groundstone tools vary considerably based on artifact type. So for instance, all stone picks are made of argillite. All axes and celts are made almost entirely from andesite, with a few other igneous rocks thrown in there as well. Things like basalt, diabase, diorite, granite, rhyolite. So things that are hard, would be difficult to break, would last long when you're beating on trees with them, right? Banner stones, however, exhibit considerable diversity in the raw material types that are being used. So this indicates all of the raw material types that make up our banner stone assemblage from Conowingo. And you can see that there is a substantial portion that's made from local slate that would have been available just downriver. But there's also a variety of other both local and non-local materials that show up in the banner stone assemblage. So I conducted a Shannon Diversity Index statistic test on the 4 different artifact types that we have with a count greater than 10. And only banner stones have this level of diversity in raw materials. So it's statistically significant difference between that and all other groundstone tool types. So looking at the chipstone assemblage from Conowingo, we focus specifically on chipstone projectile points, mainly because we were interested in getting information that could be temporally diagnostic. And so we wanted tools that had the potential to give us that type of information. So we had a total of 253 projectile points that were analyzed. And analysis consisted simply of the identification of diagnostic projectile point types, raw materials, and whether or not the point was broken. And point types were identified based on Custer 2001's classification of arrowheads and spear points in eastern Pennsylvania and the MiddleArchaic. Not that I just have copies laying around. So we made those identifications very conservatively. I'm definitely a lumper, not a splitter, particularly for the purposes of this analysis. We wanted to get a broad perspective on what this might represent. So if a specific type was not able to be identified, points were classified as either miscellaneous broad blade, miscellaneous lancelet, miscellaneous stemmed, or miscellaneous side notched, if at all possible. And then if even that determination was not able to be made, the point was classified as an indeterminate type. However, only 8%, a total of 16 points, were classified as indeterminate. So most of them were not so broken that they couldn't be placed into at least the miscellaneous categories. There were an additional 21% of the assemblage, a total of 41 points, that were classified as the various miscellaneous types. And you can see 2 of those types listed here, side notched and stemmed. So those 2 miscellaneous types do have broad temporal associations. If you find any old stemmed or side notch point, it can generally be dated to somewhere between the Late Archaic and the Middle Woodland. Not very specific though. And the same actually goes for many of the specific types that are identified in Custer's typology. So all of these listed down here, Bear Island, Piquia, Piney Island, Poplar Island, all of those could fall anywhere in that range of Late Archaic through Middle Woodland. And I should also throw in the caveat here that I classified all triangle points as Late Woodland. This is in part due to my Midwestern biases, having been a Midwestern archaeologist for the past decade, where triangles are all from the Late Woodland to the Late Prehistoric. But I know that that's not the case out here, and that triangles can also end up being Late Archaic. The raw materials that they're made out of, though, you'll see later, do definitely suggest a Late Woodland association for most of these triangles. And we do know there was a Late Woodland component at Conowingo. That's the part that washed away when the dam was opened in 1936. So The number of triangles, is our only late woodland diagnostic type. So the weight of that when it comes to a late woodland occupation should be taken with a grain of salt, because that's just based on triangular points. This is only a lithic analysis. We didn't do any diagnostic pottery analysis for this project. So we looked at raw material types for all projectile points, regardless of their temporal affiliation. Yeah, question?
There's 2 questions in the chat. There was a question about why are they caching them in a particular location, and can you restate the name of your points guide?
Yes, so the reason that you'll often see people caching tools at a particular location is because it's the same location that they return to year after year. So, banner stones, particularly in their early stages as preforms, are heavy. I wouldn't want to carry them around with me as I'm moving around the landscape in my seasonal round. So if you're primarily using them at this base camp location, or there's something that might be traded up the river, then that's a good reason to cache them there. But there's lots of reasons that people cache stuff. So that's a tough one to answer. And the name of the projectile point guide is, I'll type this in the chat too, Classification Guide for Arrowheads and Spear Points of Eastern Pennsylvania and the Central Mid-Atlantic, and it's by J. Custer. Ignore my sticky note on it. J. Custer. It's a really nice guide. I like it. It's relatively recent, I think 2006, if I remember correctly, 2001. I guess that was 20 years ago now. What do everything after 2000 seems recent to me. But I like it because it has a flow chart of how to identify point types. So it's like a choose your own adventure of identifying point types, so if it's got a narrow blade, go to question 11. If it has a broad blade, go to question 16. And so it's got a really systematic way of identifying points that I'm really keen on. Point types are super subjective. And so any way that I can systematize it so that different people are identifying things the same way, even if we're all wrong, at least we're all wrong the same way. So that's why I really like using this guide rather than some of the other more well-known ones. So were there any other questions that I missed? Feel free to interrupt me if there's more that I'm missing. Okay. So
that's it for now. You're doing great. Okay.
So raw materials for the projectile points. As you can see, it's heavily weighted towards quartz. 38% of the assemblage, about 106 points, were made from quartz. That's not altogether surprising because there's a lot of quartz available. Any of you that have worked in this area of Maryland know that there's just lots of quartz. The other most common raw material types are rhyolite, 17%, and quartzite, 16%. They're also pretty well represented. Chert and argillite also each represent roughly 10% of the assemblage, and the remainder of the assemblage is composed of andesite, which trying to make points out of andesite is rough, jasper, and some other unidentified raw materials. But those all composed a relatively small part of the assemblage. And these results do not deviate significantly from the raw materials in the debitage that was recovered during ASM's 1981 and 1982 field seasons. They also encountered a predominance of quartz and a smaller amounts of chert, rhyolite, quartzite, argillite, a slightly larger amount of jasper than we found in our finished tools. But all of this suggests that the tools that were found in the Stearns collection are representative of the types of stone that was being worked at the site. So these aren't points that were being traded from somewhere far away as finished objects. They were being produced there on the site. The debitage and the points match up raw material wise pretty well. Raw material utilization did vary through time, and I've got a graph looking at that a little bit later, but quartz was definitely the most well represented throughout all periods, except the Middle Woodland, where quartzite pops up for a little while, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I want to kind of draw this back to our primary questions, right? We wanted to look at temporal associations of the site, get some information about when it was occupied and for how long. And we also wanted to look at what raw materials can tell us about the site's external connections in the region. So based on the data from the ASM investigations, Conowingo has been interpreted as a base camp site occupied from the late Archaic through the late Woodland periods. However, both chipstone and groundstone objects in the Stearns collection indicate that there was a substantial occupation that occurred during the Middle Archaic as well. You can see that just based on, these are the chipstone results over here on this graph. So a total of 35 projectile points diagnostic of the Middle Archaic period were identified in Stearns's collection. Additionally, the large quantity of banner stones at the site are also indicative of a Middle Archaic occupation. Both banner stones and gorgets, which are pictured here, these are both broken gorgets, are usually understood to have been used as at-lattice weights. However, most banner stones are attributed to the Middle Archaic, while gorgets only showed up in the Late Archaic. We actually can get even a little more specific than that based on banner stone morphology. So several researchers have been able to assign broad temporal associations to particular banner stone morphologies throughout the region, both in the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. So the banner stones from Conowingo can be classified as one of 4 different types. Shield, of which we had 2 artifacts, rectangular, we also had 2 of those, boat, which we had 2 again, and winged types, which we had 69 of. So definitely the predominant type at Conowingo. So both boat and winged banner stones are typically attributed to the Middle Archaic, while shield banner stones were made during the Late Archaic. And rectangular banner stones do not have a temporal association that we're aware of at this time. So the unfinished nature of most of the banner stones at Conowingo suggests that banner stones were being produced locally and had not been, curated elsewhere and then showed up at the site during the Late Archaic. They were being made there in the Middle Archaic. Additionally, the predominance of relatively local raw materials like slate, steatite, andesite, these also support an interpretation of local production during the Middle Archaic rather than curation and then deposition later in the Late Archaic. So what then, we can definitively say, I think, that there's definitely a Middle Archaic occupation at the site. What then can we say based on what we know about the raw material utilization at the site? People's lithic raw material choices have long been relied upon to make inferences about priorities for time and energy expenditures in procurement, and preparation, and tool production. And things like reliance on high quality, non-local materials have been used to draw conclusions about the cultural value of lithic technology, as well as potential trade relationships. So utilization of these kind of non-local materials is typically coupled with an emphasis on curated tools. Using high quality, non-local raw materials means you're going to curate those tools, use them longer, resharpen them, use them again, and so on. In contrast, reliance on poor quality local raw materials has been interpreted as evidence for constrained access to non-local materials, right? So it's just harder to get that stuff that's further away, and a decreasing cultural value for lithic tools. It's just not important enough for you to go further away to get the raw materials for them. And then those kind of circumstances are often coupled with expedient rather than curated tools, just use it once and done type of technology. So, lithic, I don't want to oversimplify this, lithic raw material choices are the result of numerous factors, and they're not easily unraveled. But I do think that they can provide significant insight into the regional social climate based on highlighting instances of territoriality or trade. So in the case of Conowingo, where raw materials are overwhelmingly local, both in terms of ground and chipstone, the most common stone raw materials are slate, andesite, steatite, and phyllite when it comes to ground stone. All of these have sources within 10 kilometers of Conowingo. So this is a map looking at the superficial geology of the region. This red spot is Conowingo here on the Susquehanna River. And then we've got different rock types in the area. It's a little surprising that gneiss is so poorly represented in the assemblage, given that it makes up the bedrock of the area, but accessible outcrops of gneiss are pretty limited. So that's not too surprising. There are also very few distinguishable patterns in groundstone raw material use through time. Both axes, which are diagnostic of the late archaic, and celts, which are diagnostic of pretty much any part of the woodland, are made primarily from andesite. So there, it seems like there's not much change through time. Everyone's just choosing their raw materials strictly based on function when it comes to groundstone tools. The only significant temporal change in groundstone raw material utilization is the raw material variability between the production of banner stones and gorgets. So during the Middle Archaic, atlatl weights in the form of banner stones were made from a plethora of raw materials, including the plentiful local slate. But by the Late Archaic, atlatl weights were represented solely by gorgets made in one of two forms at the site, two-holed or one-holed, but all roughly the same shape, and they were only made from slate. So to me, this seems to indicate a shift to a more standardized tool production process with less room for individual expression, at least in raw material selection. Everybody's just using the same raw material type by the time we get to the Late Archaic for their atlatl weights. As opposed to in the Middle Archaic, everybody's got a different idea about which rock type they like to use best. So I think there's a little more individual expression showing up in the Late Archaic, at least in the form of atlatl weights. The chipstone assemblage also seems to indicate an emphasis on local raw materials with some divergences from that model. So almost 40% of the chipstone artifacts from the Stearns collection are made from quartz, which appears in cobbles throughout the region. It would have been readily accessible, although it's not necessarily very high quality. Any of you that have ever tried to nap quartz know that it's highly variable in the quality that you get. And even if you get something that's good quality quartz, it's not very high quality in comparison to many other types of raw materials. Some of the other raw materials that make up the significant portions of the Stearns assemblage are less local. So quartzite, which is the Here's the red star indicates Conowingo. Quartzite is the yellow dot down here on the Chesapeake. So that's where the closest known source of quartzite is, about 70 kilometers south on the western shore of the Chesapeake. Rhyolite, which is most plentiful up on South Mountain in Adams County, Pennsylvania, where the purple dot is. That's accessible via the Susquehanna River, going up north along the Susquehanna and then west along Conowingo Creek, approximately 150 kilometers by boat. And chert also shows up in not insignificant proportions in the Conowingo assemblage, where the closest source is 150 kilometers north along the Susquehanna River in Snyder County, Pennsylvania. So together, these three sources represent almost 45% of the Stearns assemblage. Meanwhile, Jasper, indicated here by the orange circle, has a source only 50 kilometers away by boat, 30 kilometers away by land, is almost entirely absent from the assemblage. It's much closer, much higher quality, and yet they're not using it. To me, this suggests that Conowingo served as a node on a network in the Susquehanna drainage, where the Iron Hill Jasper Quarry is situated on a tributary of the Delaware River. So hence out of the people of Conowingo's network. The quantity of quartz artifacts in the Stearns collection, coupled with the predominance of quartz debitage, 65% of the debitage recovered by ASM, also suggests that there was a substantive local production component using only local raw materials. And that was just supplemented by trade for or travel to other raw material sites. This is particularly interesting, I think, because there's definitely good evidence for territoriality in this region, particularly during, early contact period, even late pre-contact period. Territoriality based on waterways is to be expected. But seeing that sort of territoriality show up in raw material profiles as early as the Archaic is something a little bit new to us, but it shows up pretty clearly in the raw material profile for Conowingo.
We have 2 questions.
Okay, what do we got?
So we have, are there any functional differences between the bannerstone shapes? And do we assume the materials were all quarried, or could some have also been riverborne or delivered as cobbles?
Okay, so good questions. One, the bannerstone shapes. So Callie, you've done a little more bannerstone research than me. Did you see anything in the literature about functional differences based on shape? Has anyone done that research yet?
So nothing I read said anything about there being a functional difference, but I mean, that's not to say that it isn't there, because we were mostly looking for temporally diagnostic, not like functionally different, but it would be interesting to look into too.
I don't know if anyone's done the experimental work to answer that question. That would definitely be an experimental thing where I'd have to see if one particular type would throw your darts better than another.
Winged I would guess winged, because it would be more aerodynamic in theory.
You could, yeah, I mean, that's definitely an idea, and
Just like,
certainly supported by the predominance of winged in the assemblage, if it works better. But yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. That's a future research question. And the other question about cobbles is a great question also. We don't see a lot of cobbles. Quartzite maybe showed up in river wash cobbles, but definitely not chert, and also not rhyolite showing up in these areas in the waterways. So most people in the region seem to attribute, most archaeologists attribute particularly the rhyolite to the rhyolite quarries in Adams County, Pennsylvania. And there's actually some work that's been done on identifying rhyolite that's diagnostic to those quarries based on both chemistry and visual characteristics. We didn't follow up on that with the Conowingo assemblage to determine if it really is from those quarries, but it's high enough quality to be from those quarries. So that's my suspicion. The quartzite could certainly be coming from the river, though, although it does show up in a large enough quantity that I suspect it is not just coming from cobbles. You know, and large enough packages too, large enough artifacts that cobbles wouldn't be large enough to produce. So good question though. Okay, so the other thing that I want to touch on here is this idea of change through time. So combining our examination of raw material type and temporal associations. The only significant shift in chipstone raw material utilization that we see through time is an increase in the use of quartzite during the Middle Woodland and a commensurate decrease in the use of rhyolite, argillite, and chert, which you can see over the Middle Woodland here. I do not count anything that happens in the early woodland period as significant on this chart because our sample size is too small from the early woodland. The rest of these, we have at least 25 or so artifacts from each of these time periods. So enough to give us a decent idea of what's actually happening there. Early woodlands, we have a very small sample. So I think that in the Middle Woodland, if we're basing our inferences on the raw material sources on the map that I just showed you guys, then this likely represents a movement to raw material sources on the Chesapeake rather than upstream on the Susquehanna, where prior to the Middle Woodland, they're getting their resources more upstream on the Susquehanna, and then during the Middle Woodland, they're focused more on the region around the Chesapeake, so going south. And then during the Late Woodland, as elsewhere in the Eastern Woodlands region, use of all raw materials except local quartz drops precipitously. There's not much variety at all. During the Late Woodland period, folks are mostly focused on expediency, getting the raw materials that are most easily accessible. Although strangely, there is an uptick in chert as well during the Late Woodland period, which has been noted at other sites in the area, which is one of the things that leads me to believe that these triangular points are probably Late Woodland and not Late Archaic. So as you can see, the main thing is that we've got quartz is predominant through time and that uptick in quartzite during the Middle Woodland period. So to kind of bring it all together, our analysis of the Stearns collection provides a wealth of new data to add to the ASM data that was reported by McNamara in 1985 and makes up the majority of information that is currently in the site file at the Maryland Historical Trust. The projectile points that were collected by Stearns more than triple the total number of projectile points that have been recorded from the site. The groundstone from the ASM excavations consisted in its entirety of 24 hammerstones and 360 steatite vessel fragments. The Stearns collection added an additional 13 types of groundstone objects to the assemblage from Conowingo. I was at a workshop at the Maryland Historical Trust a few weeks back, and state archaeologist Charlie Hall had a great quote that I thought was very applicable to this assemblage when he was talking about Stearns collecting groundstone. And he was just like, I have never been able to find a grooved X. And I think it's because Stearns went around and collected them all. And it definitely looks that way when you look at the Conowingo collection. There's just a lot more groundstone there than we are ever going to find in controlled excavations. So in one respect, there's value simply in the quantity and variety of data that we get from the Stearns collection. But in addition to simply providing more data from Conowingo, the material from the Stearns collection significantly alters, I think, interpretations of the site's period of occupation and its place in regional networks. So, the Stearns collection and others like it really represent a trove of virtually untapped data about archaeological sites that may, for a variety of reasons, not be available for excavation. So rather than writing these sites off as destroyed, they can still contribute to our knowledge of the region's prehistory if we rely at least partially on the materials collected prior to or during the site's destruction. I know, as someone who enjoys field archaeology a lot, that it's always more fun to go dig something up yourself. And as a result, archaeologists have a curation crisis where we have closets full of curated materials that have never been analyzed. And the provenience information with these materials decreases by the year as institutional memory is lost. So, when we can look at relatively well for its time provenienced materials from a collection like Stearns's collection, it really gives us valuable insight into a site that is no longer has integrity for further excavations to provide significant information. Even the materials that are still left at the site's location have been stirred up and don't really have a lot of stratigraphic context anymore. So we wouldn't get any more contextual information from them than we really do from Stearns's collection. This makes a really great opportunity, I think, for using this as a sort of preemptive mitigation of these sites, looking at these materials that were collected before these sites were destroyed. And so with that, we'd like to thank a lot of people, especially Towson University, for giving us some money to do some of this research. We always like that. Certainly the Natural History Society for letting us play with all of these artifacts and giving us the opportunity to present this research for you guys. Several of our fellow students that worked on this project with us, and of course, Lisa Krause and Jason Schellenhammer, who have graciously provided lots of information on these collections while we've worked on them. So thank you all. Further questions?
Dr. Sterner, is there more to the collections that are in the basement or were in the basement that you'll be able to analyze?
So there's not any more from Conowingo. We've finally determined that. So this fall, I foolishly took on a project to help Lisa catalog all of the archaeology collections and get them in a new database. Callie, along with several other of my students, have been working on that project. And Conowingo is definitely the best provenienced of those collections. But even just looking at Stearns's material, there's a lot of really good information down there. So our goal this fall is to get all of those artifacts in a database where they'll be electronically recorded and searchable for researchers. And we're producing a short collections report for each collection that can go in their file if they're known sites in the state site database. So that's the extent of the research right now.
It's fabulous because all that information was sitting down there we didn't know. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's an incredible, there's some really incredible collections down there. And especially for me as a prehistoric archaeologist, a pre-contact archaeologist. You know, Lisa and Jason are both historic archaeologists, and we're pretty ecstatic when someone was interested in the rocks down there. I was like, yeah, these are really cool. So they're like, really? We thought they were cool, but we don't know. So yes, it's been a great opportunity to for the students as well to get to see some really cool stuff that you wouldn't normally get to work with. Other questions?
There are no more in the chat.
I see that.
Maybe somebody else has a question. You're all able to unmute yourselves if you have a question.
Adrian, I've got the chat up now that I'm not
Perfect.
talking all the time. Are there other collections you might have access to? Yes, people come out of the woodwork when you present stuff like this. So I've already had a couple of people approach me about collections near Conowingo. And actually there were excavations done in 2011. There was a survey done for the relicensing of the Conowingo Dam, which unfortunately the dam was relicensed despite the impact to archaeological resources both above and below the dam. I'm not really sure how that happened, but regardless, that happened. The report that money, yeah, exactly. So the report that they produced is really great, and the archaeologist who was in charge of that project actually got in touch with me after we presented this for the Archaeological Society of Maryland and said he'd be happy to give me their data, which is great. I'd like to definitely include that in our understanding of the site, since those are the most recent excavations, and they've got a good amount of debitage and good records of it as well. Not that the 1981 records aren't nice, but standards are a little different in 2011. So that's directly applicable to both Conowingo and especially some of the island sites that are right upstream from Conowingo that are more intact and represent much more accessible research opportunities in the future. So it's definitely something I've got my eye on. Other questions? Has anyone studied the petroglyphs that are upstream? Oh, yes. I know that the petroglyphs have been well documented, especially the ones up in Pennsylvania. They've actually got casts of those at the State Museum in Pennsylvania, and those are pretty thoroughly documented. There's some preservation of those, but they are publicly accessible, so you can only do so much with that, but they're pretty well documented. Yeah. Are any of these sites endangered by climate change? Absolutely. I would say your coastal sites are obviously going to be in greater danger. So looking at those quarry sites on the shores of the Chesapeake, but certainly you're going to have water levels rising everywhere that is going to impact this. Conowingo was more heavily impacted because of the dam. It's literally right underneath the dam. So even by the time Stearns got there, a large portion of the site was underwater. Now, I can go back really quickly here to, let me switch to the map of where Stearns collected. One second. And you can see the large portion of where Stearns collected. It'll show up in a second. My computer's slow when I'm zooming. The location where he collected is mostly underwater now. So that's really going to impact what you can see from any site, obviously. So here you can see this is areas that he collected, and that's all underwater now, and so it's no longer in the site boundaries. And even since the site boundaries were drawn, you can see this little area here is all underwater now as well. And so some of that is dam, some of that's definitely climate change though as well. Any other questions? I'm sorry if you went into this. Big increase in use of what? Ethan, you said there's a big increase in use from the early archaic to the middle archaic. I assume that's a use of some kind of material. Let me see here. We actually don't have, oh, I see. You're talking about an increase in occupation at the site. So we don't have much material from the early archaic. So my suspicion is two things. One, the sites during the early archaic were pretty sparse to begin with. So I don't expect to find very large sites from the early archaic. And two, I think based on the water levels of what they would have been at that time, I don't think that people would have wanted to be living there during the early archaic and late Paleo-Indian. So my suspicion is that it wasn't a particularly desirable place to spend their time until the middle archaic, and then people moved into the area, thought it was pretty nice, and decided to keep using it for the next few thousand years. But I think it just wasn't heavily used during the early archaic. I don't think it's a sample size issue so much as it's just not, they weren't there. These are all great questions, guys. You keep me on my toes. And I love the idea about doing some experimental at-lateral throwing. So you definitely keep that on the books. I've done some at-lateral experiments. The last one I did was to test the difference between using copper points and stone points. And we threw them at a dead pig on a spit, and then we roasted the pig after we were done. And it turns out that neither of them work really well, especially if you don't know what you're doing. But they both have their disadvantages. But we did not use weights on our at-laterals when we were doing those experiments. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any functional differences there.
I can see that as a future archaeology club event.
Yeah, definitely. That's all, especially when you roast the pig afterwards. It was a great event.
They probably would have us have to sign the liability waivers so we don't, conk each other in the head with the banner whites, but banner stems.
Yeah.
But
yeah, you'll want to be careful with that. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you everyone for coming. This has been great.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation.
Our pleasure. It's great to get to do a reprisal and make it better. You guys got the second go around.
I just realized I was muted, so I was commenting. I apologize. My headset was muted.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you guys for having us. I enjoyed the presentation. I was glad to do it.
Thank you. Everybody have a good evening.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks very much.